On August 14, 1847, plantation records from the Beaufort district of South Carolina documented an incident that local officials would later try desperately to erase from every historical archive. A woman, standing 7 feet 2 inches tall, purchased for the astonishing sum of $3,000, killed 6 overseers in a single night, using nothing but the chains meant to restrain her. The Charleston Medical Journal briefly mentioned her autopsy before the entry was torn from every surviving copy. 3 witnesses who testified at the inquiry vanished within 18 months. For more than a century, the descendants of the families involved refused to discuss what happened at Riverton Hall. But recently uncovered letters and bills of sale have revealed a story so disturbing that it challenges everything we think we know about human endurance, calculated revenge, and extreme lengths people will go to preserve unspeakable secrets. Before we continue with the story of the woman known only as Tall Sarah in the surviving documents, I want to ask you something. This channel is dedicated to uncovering the darkest corners of American history, the stories that were deliberately hidden, the truths that were too uncomfortable to face. If stories like this matter to you, hit that subscribe button right now. And tell me, where are you listening from? Drop your state or city in the comments below. Knowing where our audience is located helps us uncover more regional mysteries just like this one. Now, let's return to the Beaufort district in 1847, to the event that would haunt an entire community for generations. The surviving documents tell us this much. She arrived in chains specially forged at Charleston Iron Works, each link twice as thick as the standard restraints. Beaufort District in 1847 held a peculiar place in South Carolina's rigid social hierarchy. The Regency Island cotton had made vast fortunes for families whose names appeared regularly in Charleston society pages. Yet those same families lived in constant fear of losing control over populations that outnumbered them 10 to 1. Riverton Hall, situated 7 miles inland from the coastal estates, belonged to the Grayson family. Specifically to Marcus Grayson, a man whose reputation for ruthless efficiency in plantation management earned him consulting requests from as far away as Mississippi. The Grayson plantation differed from its neighbors in one critical way. Marcus had inherited the property from his uncle in 1843 with strict instructions to modernize operations and maximize output. That meant experimenting with crop rotation, importing new agricultural techniques from the Caribbean, and, most controversially, introducing a systematic approach to labor management that other planners whispered about in the bar of the Planners Hotel. Marcus kept meticulous records. He measured everything: hours worked, food consumed, punishments administered, even the precise dimensions of the quarters where the enslaved people slept. His ledgers, now preserved in the South Carolina Historical Society archives under restricted access, reveal a mind obsessed with control and optimization. Riverton Hall itself sprawled across 800 acres of prime cottonland, bordered on the east by the swampy tributaries of the Coon River and on the west by dense maritime forest that locals avoided after dark. The main house, a 2-story structure with Doric columns imported from Italy, stood on a slight rise overlooking the fields. Behind it, arranged with geometric precision, were the work buildings: the cotton house, the mill, the blacksmith's forge, the overseer's quarters, and furthest back, barely visible from the main house, 2 rows of slave cabins that housed 127 people. As of January 1847, Marcus employed 4 overseers. Each man managed a specific sector of the operation. The head overseer, a transplanted Virginian named Tobias Finch, had worked plantation security for 12 years and prided himself on never having lost a single enslaved person to escape. Under Finch served 3 younger men: Nathaniel Huxley from Georgia, Samuel Crenshaw from North Carolina, and a local named Robert Vernon, whose family had worked Beaufort District land for 3 generations. Together, the 4 enforced order through a combination of constant surveillance and calculated displays of authority, a system Marcus referred to in his correspondence as preventative discipline. For 4 years, the system ran smoothly. Then, In July 1847, Marcus received a letter from his factor in Charleston, a man named Edmund Lattimore, who specialized in unusual acquisitions. The letter, now preserved in the Grayson family papers at the University of South Carolina, described an opportunity that might intrigue a planner of Marcus's progressive ambitions. A woman of extraordinary physical size and strength had become available through the estate sale of a deceased Virginia planter. She stood over 7 feet tall, possessed remarkable musculature, and, according to the letter, had proven difficult to manage at her previous location. The Virginia estate wanted her gone quickly and quietly. The asking price was $3,000, more than triple the cost of a prime field hand. Marcus discussed the purchase with Finch over dinner on July 18th. The overseer's reaction, recorded in Marcus's journal, was cautious. Such a specimen, Finch warned, might prove more trouble than profit. Physical anomalies often correlate with mental deficiencies or unmanageable temperaments, he said. But Marcus saw opportunity where Finch saw risk. A woman of that size could revolutionize field productivity. She could serve as living proof that his system control could handle even the most challenging cases. On July 23rd, Marcus traveled to Charleston to inspect the woman himself. What he saw convinced him immediately. She stood 7 feet 2 inches tall, with a bone structure described in the accompanying medical report as congoid variant, exceptionally dense, with an estimated weight between 240 and 260 pounds. Her shoulders were broader than most men's, her hands large enough to wrap around a man's skull. But what struck Marcus most, according to his journal that night, were her eyes, alert, calculating, filled with an intelligence that suggested sharp observation and careful memory. He purchased her on the spot, along with the specialized restraints commissioned for her transport. The bill of sale, dated July 24th, 1847, lists her simply as Sarah, age approximately 28 to 32 years. Unusual. Height, remarkable. Virginia-born. Sold as is, with no warranty of temperament. No surname, no family history, no record of her previous labor, nor the circumstances that had made the Virginia state so eager to sell her. She arrived at Riverton Hall on August 3, 1847, transported in a reinforced wagon whose sides had been raised to contain her massive frame. The chains binding her wrists and ankles had been forged specifically for her dimensions. Each cuff were inches wide, each chain link as thick as a man's thumb. The entire apparatus weighed nearly 40 pounds. Marcus had ordered additional security measures, a high-walled wagon bed, 2 armed guards riding alongside, and strict instructions that she was not to be released from her restraints until proper accommodations had been prepared at Riverton Hall. Word of her coming had already spread. The enslaved people at Riverton Hall had been whispering about her arrival for days. News traveled to quarters with strange, silent precision, something Marcus never fully understood, despite all his efforts to monitor and control communication. By the time her wagon came into view, every person not actively working the fields had somehow found a reason to be within sight of the main yard. What they saw disturbed them deeply, in ways that went far beyond her towering size. One woman, recorded in the ledgers as Dina, later testified, "She looked at us like she was counting, like she was measuring something we couldn't see." Another, a man named Jupiter who worked in the stables, said, "Her face had no fear in it, and that scared me worse than if she'd been crying or fighting. She looked like she was waiting for something." Marcus had ordered a special holding area constructed inside one of the storage buildings, a room with reinforced door, a bar window, and a floor-mounted iron ring to which her chains could be secured. Finch objected, warning that the location was too close to the regular quarters. But Marcus insisted. He wanted the others to see her, to witness what he called proper management of the most difficult case. He believed her confinement would serve both as demonstration and deterrent. The first 3 days passed without incident. Sarah was fed twice daily, allowed limited movement within her secured room, and subjected to what Marcus termed observational assessment. Finch and his men took shifts watching her through the barred window, studying her behavior, her reaction to commands, her physical limits. Marcus visited personally each morning, accompanied by Dr. Samuel Pritchard, the local physician who handled plantation health and who had expressed scientific interest in examining someone of Sarah's extraordinary proportions. Dr. Pritchard's notes from those examinations, discovered in 1962 in the basement of a demolished Charleston Medical College building, reveal unsettling details. He measured her skull, her limbs, her bone density. He tested her strength by having her grip iron bars while he applied increasing weight. He recorded that her pulse remained steady even under strain, her breathing calm, her endurance extraordinary. She seemed to feel pain, but only to acknowledge it, not to react. Her stoicism suggested either an unusually high pain threshold or a kind of mental discipline Pritchard had never encountered before. But what disturbed him most, as revealed in his private journal, was her silence. She never spoke, never cried out during the examinations, never responded to questions, whether in English or in the limited French Pritchard tried. She simply watched, eyes following every movement in the room, expression fixed and unreadable. At moments, he swore he saw something calculating in her gaze, almost mathematical, as she studied the hinges of the door and the anchor points of her chains. On the fourth day, August 7th, Marcus decided she was ready to join the regular labor schedule. He ordered Finch to fit her with standard work restraints, lighter chains that allowed movement in the fields but prevented escape, and assigned her to cotton picking under the supervision of Nathaniel Huxley, who oversaw the western fields. What happened next would become the focus of conflicting testimonies during the inquiry that followed. Huxley's version, given to the magistrate 2 weeks later, claimed that Sarah attacked him without provocation when he tried to adjust her chains. But 3 enslaved witnesses, whose testimony was reluctantly collected only to establish a timeline, told a very different story. They said Huxley had ordered Sarah to kneel for the chain adjustment. She obeyed without resistance. Then, unprovoked, he struck her across the face with his coiled whip, not as punishment for any offense, but, as he put it, to establish proper understanding from the start. Sarah did not react. She didn't cry out, didn't flinch, didn't even blink. She stayed kneeling, her eyes fixed on Huxley's face, expression unchanged. That silence, that stillness, rattled him. He struck her again, harder this time, the whip cutting her lip and drawing blood. Still nothing. No sound, no movement, no emotion. According to witnesses, it was Huxley who broke first. His hand trembled. He stepped back and ordered her to stand and begin working. She rose to her full height, towering over him by more than a foot, and without a word, turned toward the cotton rows. For the rest of that day, she worked with machine-like precision, picking cotton at 3 times the normal rate, never slowing, never resting. Her chains clinked rhythmically with each movement through the fields. That night, after the work crews had returned to their quarters and supper had been served, Finch made a decision that would change everything that followed. He summoned his 3 subordinate overseers to join him in conducting what he called a comprehensive orientation session with Sarah. The stated purpose, according to Finch's daily log, was to establish clear behavioral expectations and demonstrate the consequences of resistance or noncompliance. The session was scheduled for 9 o'clock that night, inside Sarah's holding room, after the rest of the enslaved population had been locked in their cabins. Marcus Grayson would later claim he hadn't been informed in advance, but letters later found in his desk drawer suggested otherwise. What is certain is that at approximately 8:45 p.m. on August 7th, 1847, Finch, Huxley, Crenshaw, and Vernon gathered outside the storage building where Sarah was held. Each man carried the tools of his trade: whips, clubs, leather straps, and in Finch's case, a set of iron devices known as thumbscrews. Technically illegal in South Carolina, but still widely used in private discipline sessions. 2 enslaved men, Jupiter from the stables and Abraham from the cotton house, were ordered to stand guard outside, with strict instructions to prevent anyone from approaching. Both men later testified that they were positioned deliberately out of sight of the barred window, but close enough to hear everything that happened inside. What they heard over the next hour would haunt them for the rest of their lives, though neither man could ever fully put the events into a coherent narrative. The session began, according to their testimony, with the sound of chains rattling, followed by Finch's voice barking commands. Then came the sharp crack of leather striking flesh, the dull thud of wood against muscle, the metallic scraping of restraints being adjusted. But what disturbed both men most was not what they heard, it was what they didn't. There were no screams, no cries, no pleading, nothing from Sarah. Only the steady rhythm of blows and the occasional muffled voice of one of the overseers, though Jupiter and Abraham couldn't make out the words. This continued for about 40 minutes. Then, suddenly, the nature of the sounds changed. Abraham would later describe it as the chains starting to move different, faster, and the men's voices getting louder. Not angry. Something else. Something that made my stomach sick. Jupiter said it reminded him of when you butcher a hog and it knows what's coming, when it starts thrashing before the blade. Both men agreed on the exact moment everything turned. They heard Finch shout, "Hold her down," followed by a sound Jupiter described as metal screaming, and Abraham compared to a ship's anchor chain snapping in a storm. Then came the sounds of something heavy swinging through the air, impacts against flesh and bone, men's voices raised in genuine terror. And beneath it all, for the first time since her arrival at Riverton Hall, Sarah made a sound. Not a scream, not a cry, but a low, sustained tone, a sound neither man could describe except to say that it made the hair on their arms stand up and filled them with the primal urge to run, no matter the consequences. The chaos lasted perhaps 2 minutes. 2 minutes of crashing impacts, shattering wood, men shouting commands that went unanswered, and that terrible, continuous sound from Sarah. Then silence, a complete, heavy silence that, both men said later, felt even worse than the violence that had come before it. Jupiter and Abraham stood frozen outside the door, neither dared to look through the window, neither willing to open the door, paralyzed by what they'd heard and what that silence might mean. They waited there for perhaps 5 minutes, though both admitted that time felt distorted, stretched and warped by fear, until the door finally opened from the inside. Sarah stepped out. She was still in chains, but now held roughly 6 feet of loose iron links in her hands. The end of the chain glistened in the moonlight, dripping something dark. She was breathing heavily, the first time either man had seen her show any sign of exertion. Her prison dress was torn and stained. She looked at them, and Abraham would later struggle to describe that expression. Not angry, not scared, just empty, like something had gone out of her and left something else behind. Without a word, she walked past them, moving toward the main path that ran to the plantation grounds. Her gait was steady, purposeful, and despite the 40 pounds of chain that still clung to her wrists and ankles, she moved with an ease that seemed to defy her size. Jupiter and Abraham watched her go, neither man trying to stop her, neither even daring to look inside the room she had come from. Finally, Abraham gathered enough courage to approach the doorway and peer inside, a decision he would later call the worst mistake of my life. The holding room, roughly 12 feet by 15, looked like something massive and uncontrollable had torn through it. The iron ring that had once anchored Sarah's chains had been ripped completely out of floorboards. The surrounding was splintered upward. The small table and 2 chairs inside were smashed to pieces, fragments scattered across the floor. And there, in different positions around the room, lay Finch, Huxley, Crenshaw, and Vernon. Abraham didn't enter. He didn't need to. Even from the doorway, lit only by a single oil lamp that had somehow survived the destruction, he could see enough to know that all 4 men were dead. The exact nature of their injuries would later be recorded by Dr. Pritchard and a magistrate, but Abraham noted only one thing. They looked like they'd been hit by something no human could lift, and hit more times than you could count. He backed away from the door, turned to Jupiter, and said quietly, "We need to wake Mr. Grayson." But Sarah was not running. She was walking, slowly, methodically, across the plantation grounds, following the main path toward the slave quarters, where the others were locked in for the night. Several people, awakened by the earlier commotion, watched from their cabin windows as she passed. One woman, recorded as Rachel, later testified, she walked like she knew exactly where she was going, like she'd been waiting a long time to get there. Sarah stopped at the building that housed the plantation's blacksmith forge and workspace. The door was locked, but that proved no obstacle. Using the chain still attached to her wrists, she struck the lock 3 times, deliberate measured blows, until it broke. Then she entered the building. From the nearby cabins, witnesses could see her silhouette moving in the dark, hear the sharp clang of metal on metal, and see sparks flash briefly in the forge area. She remained inside for about 15 minutes. When she emerged, the chains on her wrists and ankles were gone. In her hands, she carried tools, a hammer, a chisel, and something that looked like a pry bar. Then she began walking toward another building, the storage house used as a plantation's holding facility for enslaved people awaiting sale or transfer to harsher labor camps. It was built from heavy timbers, reinforced with iron bands, and had no windows. Inside that night were 3 people who, that night, inside the storage building, 3 prisoners were being held. 2 men who had tried to escape the month before, and a woman who had fought back against an overseer. Sarah approached the door, and with the tools she had taken from the forge, began dismantling the lock. It took her around 5 minutes. 5 long minutes during which more and more people in the quarters awoke, watching from their windows. None of them fully understood what they were witnessing, but everyone sensed that something had changed forever, something fundamental in the balance of power that ruled their lives. When the door finally opened, the 3 captives stepped into the night, blinking in the moonlight. Sarah didn't speak a word. She didn't even acknowledge them, other than a single gesture toward the dark line of woods that bordered the western edge of the plantation. For a moment, the freed prisoners stood frozen, clearly terrified of what accepting her silent offer might mean. Then, one after another, they ran, disappearing into the tree line and vanishing into the darkness. But Sarah didn't follow them. Instead, she turned and began walking toward the main house. By now, it had been about 30 minutes since Abraham had discovered the bodies in the holding room. Marcus Grayson had been awakened and had already sent riders to fetch the magistrate and Dr. Pritchard. Yet before any officials could arrive, while Grayson barricaded himself in his home with his wife, 3 children, and a loaded hunting rifle, Sarah reached the front steps of Riverton Hall's main residence. She didn't try to enter. She didn't shout or make demands. According to the testimony of enslaved witnesses watching from various points across the plantation, Sarah simply stood at the base of the steps, her towering 7-foot frame illuminated by the house's front lamps, and watched the door. Her face was expressionless, that same unreadable calm that had unnerved so many during her brief stay at Riverton Hall. She stood there for 2 full hours, unmoving, as riders galloped into the darkness to summon help. She stood there as other enslaved people, realizing they weren't being punished or stopped, slowly emerged from their quarters. They gathered behind her in a loose semicircle, not joining her, not opposing her, simply witnessing something none of them could put into words. She stood there still when the first light of dawn began to touch the sky, revealing the full scope of what had happened during the night. When the magistrate finally arrived at sunrise, accompanied by 6 armed men and Dr. Pritchard, they found Sarah exactly where she had been, standing at the foot of the steps, surrounded now by more than 70 enslaved people who had gathered silently through the night. The magistrate later described the scene in his official report as disturbing in its implications and organized in appearance, suggesting that what they saw was not a random act, but something premeditated. Sarah did not resist when the armed men approached. She allowed them to bind her in new, heavier chains so weighty it took 3 men to carry them, and to lead her toward a wagon prepared for transport. She looked back only once, her eyes sweeping over the silent crowd that had gathered to witness her. Several people later testified that in that moment they saw something in her expression they could never name. Not triumph, not relief, but perhaps the quiet acknowledgement of something finished or something just beginning. At approximately 7 a.m. on August 8, 1847, the wagon departed Riverton Hall, carrying Sarah toward Charleston and toward whatever awaited her in the legal proceedings to come. Behind her, the plantation dissolved into a controlled chaos as officials began documenting the carnage in the holding room, collecting testimony, and struggling to construct a narrative that could make sense of the horror that had unfolded during those hours. The aftermath of that night sent shockwaves through the entire planter class of Beaufort District, far beyond the deaths of the four overseers. Within days, Marcus Grayson found himself defending not only his decision to purchase Sarah, but his entire system of management, before a hastily assembled inquiry of neighboring planters and magistrates. The hearings held at the Beaufort County Courthouse between August 12th and 18th produced hundreds of pages of testimony that exposed deeply uncomfortable truths about how Riverton Hall and plantations like it truly operated. Dr. Pritchard's autopsy of the four dead overseers, conducted on August 8th and recorded in meticulous detail, confirmed facts that sent chills through every plantation owner in the district. All four men had died from massive blunt force trauma. Injuries consistent with being struck repeatedly by something heavy and metallic, specifically the iron chains that had once bound Sarah's wrists and ankles. The wounds, according to Pritchard, showed evidence of deliberate, methodical targeting rather than a frenzied outburst, each blow precisely aimed to incapacitate. Even more unsettling was what Pritchard found in the details, evidence that contradicted the official claim of a sudden, unprovoked attack. In his private journal, discovered decades later, Pritchard wrote that all four men displayed signs of prolonged physical exertion, their hands bearing the marks of gripping and restraining, as if they had been engaged in a sustained struggle. The positions of their bodies, too, suggested a complex sequence of events, not simply a one-sided act of violence, but something far more deliberate. In his private notes, which he clearly never intended to publish, Pritchard concluded that the four men had participated in a coordinated action against Sarah before she retaliated, and that this action had continued long enough to provoke an extreme, perhaps fatal, response. He omitted those conclusions from his official report. Years later, in a letter dated 1853, Pritchard would explain why. To have recorded the full implications of my findings, he wrote, would have raised questions the planter class of this district was not prepared to face. Questions about the methods employed in the management of human property. The social order depended upon certain truths remaining unexamined. The inquiry itself shifted focus, away from the deaths of the four overseers, which were quickly dismissed as tragic casualties of a dangerous profession, and toward the larger issue of Sarah's legal status and her ultimate fate. Under South Carolina law in 1847, the punishment for an enslaved person who killed a white individual was clear and absolute: execution. By law, execution by hanging was mandatory, carried out publicly to serve as a warning to others. But Sarah's case introduced complications that made the simple application of those laws politically impossible. First, there was the matter of witness testimony. The inquiry heard from Jupiter and Abraham, who could only describe what they had heard that night, not what they had seen. Their statements raised deeply uncomfortable questions about what had truly happened in that holding room before the chains broke. Several magistrates noted that if the overseers had engaged in acts beyond legitimate discipline, and the evidence strongly indicated they had, then the legality of Sarah's actions became far less clear. Under South Carolina law, even enslaved individuals retained limited rights to self-defense against unlawful violence, though this principle was rarely acknowledged or invoked. Second, there was the issue of economics. Marcus Grayson had paid $3,000 for Sarah, a substantial sum representing a major investment, one that would be lost completely if she were executed. Through his attorney, Grayson argued that the deaths were the result of poor restraint procedures, not any inherent savagery on Sarah's part, and that with proper control she could still provide valuable labor. Many planners, worried about how her execution might set a precedent affecting their own financial interests, supported this view. Third, and perhaps most troubling of all, was the reaction of the enslaved population. In the week following the incident, not a single escape attempt was reported from Riverton Hall. highly unusual, considering confusion and reduced oversight. Yet the enslaved people had not returned to their normal patterns either. They moved through their duties with perfect mechanical efficiency, but without the deferential gestures and quiet compliance that typically define daily life on the plantation. Nearby plantations reported the same phenomenon. Overseers from across the district began to notice changes in behavior as news of Sarah's actions spread to the hidden communication networks that enslaved people maintained, channels that planters never truly understood, nor could they control. The inquiry concluded on August 18th with a compromise verdict, one that satisfied no one, but avoided the most explosive political and economic consequences. Sarah would not be executed immediately. Instead, she would be held in secure custody while officials evaluated her mental state and potential for rehabilitation. Marcus Grayson would forfeit ownership and all financial claims to her. Sarah would be declared property of the state, no longer Grayson's, yet not fully a criminal in the legal sense. The deaths of the 4 overseers were officially attributed to inadequate supervision rather than her intent. Their families would receive compensation from a special fund, collected through contributions from district planners, and the precise details of what had taken place in that room would be sealed, classified as sensitive to ongoing security concerns, and omitted from all public court records. Sarah herself appeared at the inquiry for only one day, August 13th, when the magistrates demanded to see her in person to judge her mental state and physical condition. She was transported from the Charleston jail, where she was kept in a reinforced cell, and brought to the courthouse under heavy guard. Newspaper reports from the Charleston Mercury and the Beaufort Republican described the event in language that revealed just how profoundly her presence disturbed those who saw her. The woman stood before the assembled magistrates with neither defiance nor submission visible in her bearing, wrote the Mercury's correspondent. She is of truly remarkable proportions, and her silence throughout the questioning, she would not, or could not, speak even when directly addressed, created an atmosphere of profound disquiet in the chamber. Several gentlemen remarked afterward that they had never encountered a human presence so unsettling in its opacity, as though they looked upon a door behind which some terrible knowledge waited, yet could not be reached. Dr. Pritchard, called to assess Sarah's mental condition, gave testimony carefully worded to avoid any conclusion that might demand her immediate execution. He described her as mentally sound but selectively mute, possibly the result of trauma suffered before her arrival in the district. He noted that her body bore extensive scarring, consistent with years of repeated punishment and restraint, and that her skeletal structure suggested either a rare genetic condition or early life exposure to environmental factors promoting abnormal growth. What Pritchard did not say in his official statement, but wrote later in his private journal, was that he did not believe Sarah incapable of speech. Rather, he believed she was choosing silence deliberately as a form of control. He was convinced that she understood everything said around her and was making precise, calculated decisions about when or if she would respond. During her examination, Pritchard attempted several methods to provoke a verbal reaction: sudden sharp pain, startling noises, unexpected personal questions. Yet Sarah remained completely silent. Only her eyes moved, tracking his every gesture with what he described as disconcerting precision and an almost analytical interest in my methods. After the inquiry concluded, Sarah was returned to Charleston and confined in a facility used for enslaved people awaiting sale or transport. But the city's magistrates now faced a dilemma. What could be done with someone who could not legally be executed without reopening politically dangerous questions, yet could not be sold back into private ownership without creating immense liability? The solution they reached would determine the course of her life for the next 3 years. Sarah was declared state property, assigned to secure labor under government supervision. In practice, this meant she could be leased to state projects requiring intense physical work, while remaining under the special security protocols her case demanded. Over the next 3 years, she was transferred repeatedly between such assignments: a stone quarry outside Columbia, a rice processing facility near Georgetown, a railroad construction site in the interior, and briefly, a state-owned mining operation in the upcountry. Records from these various postings are incomplete and sometimes contradictory, yet certain patterns stand out. Sarah consistently performed labor at levels that far exceeded expectation. One railroad foreman wrote that she accomplished in 8 hours what would normally take a team of men 12 to 16 hours to complete. She remained silent, except on rare occasions when communication was absolutely necessary for safety or coordination. She only spoke when absolutely necessary for coordination or safety, and even then, only in short, measured monosyllables. Her voice, observers noted, was surprisingly soft for someone of her size, carrying traces of an accent that suggested origins in Virginia or Maryland. What stood out most, however, was a growing alarm among those responsible for her containment. Each facility that held Sarah found itself forced to adopt increasingly elaborate security measures after a series of unsettling incidents revealed her combination of extraordinary strength and unnerving intelligence. At the stone quarry, she had methodically loosened the bolts securing her chain to the wall. Over the course of several weeks, not to escape, but seemingly to test the construction itself. At the rice processing facility, she demonstrated a detailed mental map of the building's layout and routines, something that only became apparent when she directed others during a sudden fire, guiding them in a manner that suggested she had rehearsed several possible emergency scenarios in advance. At the railroad site, workers noticed how she studied bridge and trestle construction with a focused intensity that made supervisors uneasy. Yet, she never attempted sabotage, nor did she make any move toward freedom. Each time a new restriction was imposed, heavier chains, closer watch, tighter protocols, Sarah adapted, calm and patient, as though she were simply collecting data on how confinement worked, waiting for something not yet clear to anyone else. Meanwhile, in Charleston, the long shadow of the Riverton Hall incident continued to reshape the district's fragile social fabric. Marcus Grayson, ruined financially by the loss of his investment and socially marked by association with the disaster, sold Riverton Hall in 1849. He and his family moved west Alabama, hoping to rebuild both fortune and reputation. Riverton Hall passed rapidly through 2 short-lived owners before being acquired in 1851 by a consortium of investors who converted it primarily to rice cultivation. Their new management style was deliberately positioned as a moral contrast to Grayson's harsh and systematic methods. Whether this shift represented genuine reform or merely a subtler continuation of cruelty remained a matter of quiet debate among the enslaved community. The 4 overseers killed that night became local cautionary figures. Some used their story to argue for more careful recruitment and training of plantation security. Others saw it as a warning that excessive control brought its own form of destruction. Finch's widow received the largest compensation from a fund established by district planners. She returned to her family home in Virginia soon after. The widows and families of Huxley, Crenshaw, and Vernon stayed in the Balfour district, though they rarely spoke of the event, referring to it vaguely as the trouble at Grayson's Place, when the topic occasionally surfaced in whispers. Among the enslaved, however, Sarah became something far more complicated than a simple legend. Stories about her spread rapidly, some based on truth, many exaggerated, others entirely invented. Their tone shifted depending on who told them. For some, she was a symbol of awe, a living embodiment of resistance, someone who had done what others only dreamed of. For others, she represented a more painful reality. Her defiance had brought harsher punishments, stricter surveillance, and tighter control across every plantation in the region. A few spoke of her as a warning rather than a hero, a reminder that rebellion carried terrible costs. She had killed 4 overseers, yet remained enslaved, living under conditions even more severe than before. The 3 individuals she freed that August night in 1847, a woman and 2 men, managed, according to later records, to reach free territory through the Underground Railroad. Their testimonies, preserved years later in Canada and Ohio, provided vivid descriptions of Sarah's appearance and demeanor. All 3 agreed on her silence and on the eerie sense of inevitability she carried, as if she were fulfilling a plan written long before. One of the men said, "It was like watching a storm approach." You knew something powerful was coming, but you couldn't stop it or even understand it. You could only stand there and watch. In 1850, a short piece appeared in a medical journal titled Observations on Physical Anomalies in the Negro Race. The author, unnamed but clearly drawing from Dr. Pritchard's examination of Sarah, discussed several cases of unusual physical development. 3 paragraphs were devoted to a woman of exceptional height and bone density observed in coastal South Carolina. The article speculated about environmental and hereditary influences that could cause such physiological variation. It stirred controversy. Some physicians condemned it, arguing that publishing such findings would only fuel pseudoscientific theories of racial hierarchy. The editor defended its inclusion as a matter of scientific curiosity, though he agreed to omit names and locations to protect the sensitive parties involved. That article eventually drew the attention of Dr. Franklin Lays, a physician and anatomist based in Augusta, Georgia. Hayes had built his career around studying what he called physiological extremes within enslaved populations. He had published several papers arguing that such cases offered valuable data for understanding the limits of human variation, and that the institution of slavery, horrifying as it was, provided a unique opportunity for study. His interest in Sarah was purely clinical, devoid of compassion. To him, she was not a person, but a specimen, a rare anomaly whose body might reveal secrets about race, biology, and strength. In early 1851, Hayes wrote to South Carolina authorities, requesting Sarah's transfer to his facility in Augusta for what he described as comprehensive scientific study. The letter, still preserved in the South Carolina Department of Archives and History, outlined a proposal for a full medical and psychological investigation, with results to be published in academic journals and presented at the next conference of the American Medical Association. He offered to cover all costs of her housing and maintenance, arguing that the findings could have practical applications for plantation management and labor efficiency. Hayes's proposal generated intense debate among South Carolina state officials. Some found his reasoning persuasive, a scientific opportunity that would also relieve the state of the constant cost and danger of keeping Sarah confined. Others were deeply skeptical, warning that the arrangement would serve only to enrich Hayes through publication, while dragging South Carolina back into the public eye over an incident many wished to erase from memory. Within the enslaved community, however, the rumors carried a different tone altogether. As word of Hayes's plans filtered through the secret channels of communication that connected plantations across the state, it was met with unease and fear. Few believed this was about science. Most saw in it something far darker, another form of violation disguised as curiosity. The government had not yet reached a final decision when an unexpected event forced their hand, an event that would ultimately seal Sarah's fate. On the night of March 17, 1851, at the state-run iron mining operation near Newberry, where Sarah had been assigned to the past 4 months, something occurred that no one ever managed to fully explain. Despite multiple investigations over the following months, the official record remained confused and incomplete. The Newberry facility employed roughly 40 enslaved workers to extract iron ore. Sarah's assigned role was hauling her carts, heavy, grueling work that took advantage of her immense strength while keeping her above ground, where she could be closely monitored. That night, at approximately 2 o'clock in the morning, night guard Thomas Rutledge reported hearing strange metallic impacts echoing from the mine entrance. When he approached, he saw Sarah standing there, outside her locked quarters. Her chains gone, though the metal cuffs still clung to her wrists. She was holding a sledgehammer. With deliberate precision, she had been striking the main support beam above the mine entrance. Rutledge raised his rifle and shouted for her to drop the weapon. Sarah turned to face him. He later described the look in her eyes as calm, perfectly calm, despite the gun aimed at her chest. She set the hammer down and began to walk slowly toward him. When he barked in order to stop, she did. Then, for the first time in anyone's recorded memory, Sarah spoke, in complete, articulate sentences. "That support beam is cracked," she said in clear, educated English, her voice carrying the soft cadence of Virginia. The mine will collapse. Everyone working inside, come morning will die. I was trying to mark it so you'd see. When other guards and supervisors arrived, they examined the beam. What they found astonished them. A long, deep fracture running through the wood, evidence of an imminent structural failure. Had the morning shift entered the mine as scheduled, the collapse would likely have killed dozens. Sarah had, beyond any doubt, saved lives. Yet she had also escaped the restraints, taken tools without authorization, and moved freely in the night, offenses that usually earned brutal punishment. The subsequent investigation uncovered even more unsettling details. Sarah had been patiently loosening the bolts on her restraints over several weeks, altering the threads until she could slip them free. Witnesses among the enslaved miners reported that she had been quietly asking them about the mine structure, about how the tunnels were supported, how carts worked, even about pulley systems and ventilation shafts. One worker recalled, she spent a whole meal asking how to build one of those pulley rigs herself, like she was learning, not just asking. The realization shattered what many officials still want to believe, that Sarah was a brute or a simple-minded anomaly. She wasn't. She was intelligent, methodical, observant, and capable of long-term strategic thought. Faced with this revelation, state authorities found themselves trapped in an impossible dilemma. Punishing her for escaping would mean condemning the very person who had just prevented a tragedy. Keeping her in confinement seemed increasingly dangerous. Transferring her to Dr. Hayes, though morally questionable, would remove the problem entirely. In late April 1851, they made their choice. Sarah was handed over to Dr. Franklin Hayes in Augusta under strict legal conditions. He would assume full responsibility for her custody and provide monthly reports to South Carolina's magistrates. Hayes' facility, a converted brick warehouse on the edge of the city, had been outfitted with reinforced cells, barred observation chambers, and specialized examination rooms. Over the next 3 years, he conducted what he proudly described as a comprehensive scientific study of Sarah's physical and psychological nature. His journals, discovered decades later after his death in 1874, revealed the horrifying extent of those experiments. He subjected her to relentless physical testing, invasive measurements, endurance trials, psychological manipulation, and prolonged isolation, all under the guise of research. Through it all, Sarah maintained her pattern, silent unless words served a clear purpose. She complied with physical orders but resisted mental probing, watching everything, memorizing everything. Hayes grew increasingly frustrated. In his notes, he complained about the subject's refusal to exhibit spontaneous behavior, writing that she observes me as though conducting her own inquiry. He began to suspect correctly that she was adapting her responses to minimize harm, studying his methods as carefully as he studied hers. In September 1852, Hayes designed a cognitive experiment involving a series of mechanical puzzles that needed to be solved in precise order to unlock a door. Sarah completed the sequence in half his estimated time. Then, instead of stopping, she examined each mechanism in detail, touching, testing, and memorizing its function. When Hayes asked why, Sarah looked at him and said evenly, "I wanted to understand it, so I could build one if I needed to." The reply unsettled him deeply. In that moment, he realized a terrifying implication. For years, Sarah had been educating herself, learning how locks, restraints, and containment systems functioned. The very tools meant to imprison her had become her curriculum. By spring of 1854, Hayes' notes described a change. Sarah had begun speaking more often, engaging him in short but deliberate conversations. She asked about his medical work, about anatomy, about the body's weaknesses, which organs fail first under stress, which points cause the most pain or paralysis. Hayes finally understood, too late, that she had turned his experiment into her own. In August 1854, exactly 7 years after the Riverton Hall incident, Hayes arranged a private demonstration for 5 respected physicians: Dr. Pritchard, Dr. Lattimore, Dr. Constantine, Dr. Thornhill, and Dr. Mercer. During the session, Hayes attempted to display Sarah's alleged pain tolerance by subjecting her to deliberate harm. Several of the attending doctors objected immediately, their protests sparking a tense argument that cut the session short. As the visitors prepared to leave, Dr. Pritchard, perhaps out of guilt, turned to Sarah and quietly asked if she had been treated well. Sarah met his gaze and replied calmly, "Treatment, doctor, is relative to expectations. I expect nothing, and therefore I am never disappointed." The word silenced the room. It was both a confession and an accusation, a statement of total awareness from someone they had tried to reduce to an object. The next morning, when Hayes arrived at his laboratory, the guards met him outside, pale and trembling. Sarah was gone. During the night, she had freed herself from her restraints and escaped the facility. "He thought he was studying me," Sarah told Rachel one quiet evening as a fire crackled between them. "But I was the one learning. Every incision, every question, every moment he thought he had control. I watched him, I listened, I learned how his mind worked and what fear looked like behind his calm face." Rachel said nothing, sensing that Sarah's words were both confession and warning. Over time, the Freemans became her quiet allies, never asking too much, never pressing too far. The small farming community began to accept her silent presence, first with caution, then with a kind of reverence. Children whispered stories about the tall guardian who kept watch at night, while adults left food near the edge of the woods, pretending not to notice when it disappeared by morning. Yet, Sarah never fully joined them. Something in her remained apart, as if invisible chains still circled her mind. She worked tirelessly, but her eyes were always scanning, always measuring exits and distances. Rachel often wondered whether Sarah would ever truly believe she was safe. Then, one winter night, in early 1857, a group of bounty hunters arrived in Chester County. They carried a description that matched Sarah perfectly. The Freemans were warned by a neighbor who overheard their talk at a tavern. Without hesitation, Isaiah and Rachel went to Sarah's shed. "They're here for you," Isaiah said, his voice low but firm. Sarah looked up, her expression unreadable. "I know," she whispered. "I heard their horses." Rachel begged her to stay hidden, promising the community would protect her. But Sarah only shook her head. "If they come here and find me, they'll burn your homes to the ground. I won't bring that upon you." Before dawn, she was gone, leaving behind only her simple cot, a handmade knife, and another message written in charcoal on the shed wall. "Freedom is not a place. It's a state of knowing no one owns your next breath. Thank you for reminding me what life feels like." Search parties combed the surrounding woods for weeks. No one found her. Some said she crossed into Canada. Others swore she joined the Underground Railroad as a secret protector, guiding others north from the shadows. Years later, children in Pennsylvania still spoke of the woman in the woods, a towering figure seen at night, watching from a distance but never threatening. Farmers claimed that when storms struck, she appeared to secure loose roofs or free trapped animals before fading into the trees. Whether she was real or legend, no one could ever say for sure. Dr. Hayes, meanwhile, lived the rest of his life haunted by his own creation. In his private journal, discovered decades later, one line stood out above all others. "She was supposed to be my subject, but in the end, I became hers." If you were captivated by Sarah's story, don't forget to like this video and share it with someone who loves dark, forgotten chapters of history. Subscribe for more haunting tales from the past that refuse to stay buried. One evening during their quiet conversations, Sarah finally revealed something that left Rachel and Isaiah Freeman deeply unsettled. "He thought he was studying me," she said slowly, referring to Dr. Hayes. "But I was studying him back. I learned how bodies work, where they're weak, how to disable someone quickly and efficiently. I figured that if I was ever going to escape, I needed to understand those things. In his arrogance, he gave me the education I needed to be free." That revelation disturbed the Freemans. They suddenly understood they were giving shelter to someone who not only possessed extraordinary physical power, but also carried a detailed knowledge of human anatomy, knowledge that could make her genuinely dangerous if misused. They spent several evenings discussing whether it was wise or even safe to let her remain in their community. Their hearts told them to protect her, as they had promised, but their sense of responsibility to their neighbors made them question the risk. Finally, they decided to confront the issue openly. When they approached Sarah about their concerns, her response was not defensive or angry. It was calm and painfully sincere. She sat in silence for a long time, staring down at her hands before she spoke. "I understand your fears," she said quietly. "They're reasonable. I learned violence as a tool to survive, and I became very good at it. But I don't want that to define who I am anymore. I want to learn how to live without it, to exist in a community without being either a victim or a threat. That's why I watched your people for months before I came forward. I needed to see if a life like that was even possible." She paused again, looking at those large, powerful hands that had broken chains, taken lives, and built a shelter deep in the woods. "In the forest, I was free," she continued softly, "but I was alone. I survived, but I wasn't living. Now, I want to learn how to do both, to be free and to live among people. That's what I'm asking you to teach me." That conversation marked a turning point. From that day forward, Sarah began to appear more often during daylight hours. She joined in on construction projects around the community, her immense strength turning tasks that normally required teams of men or complicated equipment into simple work. She attended evening gatherings at the Freeman home, sitting quietly while others discussed crops, weather, or the small dramas of community life. She didn't speak much, but she listened intently, absorbing every word like someone learning a new language. Rachel soon began teaching her to read and write properly. Sarah had picked up fragments of literacy over the years, but she had never received any real instruction. Now she practiced with determination, tracing letters by lamplight in her shed until late each night. Children in the community, free of the fears that burdened their parents, were the first to truly accept her. They asked her innocent, direct questions about her height, where she came from, what it felt like to be so tall. Sarah always answered simply and honestly, and before long, several children began visiting her shed in the evenings to watch her work on carpentry, or just to see her lift something heavy with ease. The adults noticed something they hadn't seen before. Around the children, Sarah seemed different. The guarded look in her eyes softened when a child asked for help retrieving a ball from a high branch, or when she showed them how to use a hammer properly. By the spring of 1857, Sarah had become a visible, though still mysterious, part of the Chester County community. She had learned to navigate daily interactions with more comfort, though she still preferred to listen rather than speak. She began helping at other farms beyond the Freemans, exchanging her labor for lessons in new skills: coopering, leatherwork, weaving. Isaiah wrote in his journal that Sarah seemed to be building herself a complete education in freedom, trying to learn everything that had been denied to her during her years of bondage. But just when life began to seem stable, a shadow from Sarah's past threatened to return. News reached Chester County that a man claiming to be a slave hunter from South Carolina was making inquiries in nearby towns about an unusually tall woman living in the area. The description was unmistakable. It matched Sarah perfectly. The realization struck hard. Her past had not been buried. Somewhere, someone still believed she was worth capturing. The community faced a difficult decision. Many urged Sarah to flee further north, perhaps to Canada, where she would finally be beyond the reach of American fugitive slave laws. But at the first public meeting she ever attended, Sarah herself stood to speak. Her voice was steady and resolute. "I'm tired of running," she said. "I spent 9 years in bondage and 3 years hiding in the wilderness. I want to learn how to live as a free person in a community. I can't do that if I'm always running. If they come for me, they come, but I won't run anymore." Her words carried enormous weight. Everyone there had seen her transformation firsthand. Her discipline, her strength, her effort to build a life rather than merely survive. Isaiah Freeman decided to seek legal advice from abolitionist lawyers in Philadelphia. The lawyers confirmed that, technically, Sarah could still be seized under the Fugitive Slave Act. Yet her situation was far from straightforward. Her supposed ownership had been transferred under questionable conditions. Nearly a decade had passed since Riverton Hall. Witnesses were dead or missing, and most records long destroyed. And most of all, reopening her case would risk exposing what had happened in both Riverton Hall and Hayes' laboratory, things powerful people would rather keep forgotten. The community decided to act strategically. They documented Sarah's life in Chester County, collecting testimony from dozens of residents about her peaceful behavior, her labor, and her contributions. They prepared legal papers arguing that any attempt to seize her would serve no purpose except to continue an old injustice. And they quietly spread word that any forceful attempt to remove Sarah would be met with organized resistance. The slave hunter, Walter Pembroke, pressed on confidently at first, believing that finding a woman of Sarah's striking appearance would be simple. But he underestimated both the community's organization and the tangled legal issues surrounding her case. When he tried to obtain warrants, bureaucratic obstacles arose. Officials demanded clear documentation of ownership, which he couldn't provide. When he tried less official routes, he met only silence and deliberate misdirection. After several fruitless weeks, Pembroke received instructions from his employers to abandon pursuit. Later correspondence revealed that Dr. Hayes himself, when contacted for proof of ownership, had advised against continuing. His note read, "The subject in question possesses an extraordinary capacity for resistance. The cost and risk of recapture would far exceed any potential value to be gained. Some battles are better left unfought." With that, the immediate danger passed. Sarah remained in Chester County, and the community's unity in defending her became a symbol of quiet triumph over oppression. The years that followed marked a profound transformation, one that reached far beyond the boundaries of circumstance or survival. For the woman who had once lived her life under chains, freedom became not merely an absence of captivity, but the discovery of belonging, of worth, and of the quiet, unshakable strength that comes from being defended rather than merely endured. In time, she purchased 5 acres of land beside the Freeman property. Using wages earned through her own labor, with skills learned from her neighbors, she raised a modest cabin by hand and worked the soil herself, growing food, tending the earth, and hiring out her strength for demanding projects that others could not manage. Yet her greatest effort was inward, the long, uncertain process of learning to live without the constant vigilance that slavery had engraved upon her. Her friend Rachel recorded the change in her journal. In 1858, she wrote, "She is learning that not every sound means danger, that not every question hides a trap." A week later came another entry. "She laughed yesterday, truly laughed, not merely smiled at the idea of humor. The sound was strange, as if she had to remember how, but it was real." By 1860, as the country moved toward the Civil War that would at last destroy the institution that had shaped her earliest years, she had built a life few would have believed possible. She attended community meetings, helped shape decisions, and taught younger people the trades she had mastered: carpentry, blacksmithing, the mechanical arts of repair. The children who once watched her in quiet awe now came eagerly for lessons, and she proved both patient and demanding, a teacher who measured effort rather than talent. When war finally came, she offered her strength to the Union cause in practical, unheralded ways. She helped build the earthworks that guarded Pennsylvania's militia lines, moving soil and timber with a force that astonished the soldiers beside her. She carried heavy supplies, loaded wagons, and gave what she could from her small farm to regiments passing through. Yet she refused all calls to speak publicly about her past or to become a symbol in abolitionist campaigns. To one persistent journalist who sought an inspirational tale of triumph, she replied firmly, "I am not a story for others to tell. I am a person trying to live a life. If my being alive proves something about endurance or strength, That is enough, but I will not perform my pain for anyone's cause, no matter how righteous they claim it to be. After the war, as the nation struggled through Reconstruction and the newly freed sought to build lives of their own, some urged her to seek compensation, to claim justice for the years stolen from her. She refused. To go back, even for justice, would give that life more power than it deserves, she told Isaiah Freeman. I would rather live forward. The world that owned me is gone. The men who hurt me are old or dead. What good would it do to dig up the bones of that past, except to be buried under them again? Still, she spoke sometimes, though only in private and with purpose. She met with other freed people learning to navigate the strange space between bondage and freedom, offering what she had learned of patience and persistence. She told them that healing was not forgetting, but choosing who to become after the harm had been done. In 1867, a young woman arrived in Chester County, a tall, quiet figure who had fled Maryland. Years of punishment had taught her flinch at every sound, to whisper rather than speak, to sleep only in open air. The townspeople brought her to a woman who understood such things. Together they worked the fields side by side, day after day. Slowly, the younger woman began to understand that labor could be chosen rather than imposed, that the same hands once bound could build a life. Rachel Freeman wrote, "She is teaching the girl what she herself had to learn alone, that freedom is not merely the absence of chains, but the presence of choice, and that learning to make choices, after so many years of having none, is its own kind of hard work." The younger woman would later say that her life had been saved, not by rescue, but by example. "She showed me that a person can survive horror and still become whole," she said. As the years passed, the woman who had once lived in fear became an elder whose presence anchored the community. People sought her counsel, her judgment, her quiet authority. Her story was known, yet no longer defined by tragedy. She remained strong, her body still capable of feats that surprised men half her age. And though she spoke little, her silence no longer came from fear, but from peace. She had learned to live openly, to accept care, to allow herself to be part of a world that once seemed closed to her. In 1872, Rachel recorded one final conversation. They had been speaking of the past, a subject the woman rarely addressed. Rachel asked if she ever regretted the violence of Riverton Hall, if the memory of killing for men still haunted her. She was silent for a long while before answering. "I do not regret what I did. Those men chose their deeds, and I chose mine. What haunts me is not the blood, but the years I lost to mere survival. I learned to read at 30, real mathematics at 32. I learned that I loved to build things, to create instead of destroy, only after I escaped. So much of me was buried in those years when every thought, every ounce of strength, was spent just staying alive." She looked down at her hands, older now, rough from decades of use, yet still powerful. "That," she said quietly, "is what I carry. Not guilt, just the weight of what might have been." Her reflections on the past were never framed as bitterness, nor as simple mourning for violence endured. Rather, she spoke quietly of grief for the life that might have been, the years lost to bondage, and the self she might have known had freedom been hers from the start. Yet even this grief carried an acknowledgement of what she had built. "Who I am now," she said, "includes everything I survived to become. The lost years made me, even as they took from me. I carry both the loss and what I created from it." When she passed in January 1889, at roughly 65 years of age, her death marked the close of an era for Chester County's Black community. Her funeral drew more than 200 people. Among them were those who had known her in bondage and had been inspired by her life. Children she had taught, now adults with families of their own, neighbors who had worked beside her for decades, and visitors from distant states who had come specifically to honor the woman whose existence had transcended her individual circumstances. The community placed a simple stone marker at her grave. It bore her name and the years of her life, along with one understated line: "She survived to live." There was no reference to her remarkable height, no mention of Riverton Hall, No recounting of the violence that had defined her early life. The monument made no claim of dramatic escape or triumphant struggle. Its significance lay entirely in the recognition that she had not only endured terrible circumstances, but had learned, against all odds, to live fully beyond them. At her funeral, Isaiah Freeman spoke with quiet conviction. Sarah taught us that freedom is not given by the absence of chains, but earned through the daily choice to live openly, to risk connection, to build rather than merely survive. She showed us that healing is possible even from the deepest wounds. That transformation is real, and that who we choose to become matters far more than what was done to us. We are all better for having known her. Meanwhile, in South Carolina, the Grayson plantation gradually vanished from the landscape. The land passed through multiple owners over decades, subdivided and sold piece by piece. The buildings where she had once been held fell to ruin, eventually swallowed by forest and swamp. No historical marker ever commemorated what had occurred there. Local historians occasionally referenced the property in academic work, but details were muted, cloaked in euphemistic language about labor difficulties and challenges in management. Dr. Hayes' research, published posthumously by his daughter in 1876, briefly stirred debate in medical circles. Some applauded its comprehensive documentation, while others condemned the ethics of his methods. But the controversy quickly faded, eclipsed by new directions in scientific inquiry. Hayes' name, however, remained forever tinged with questions he preferred to leave unanswered. The cost of knowledge gained through exploitation. The four overseers who died at Riverton Hall, Finch, Huxley, Crenshaw, and Vernon, slowly slipped from memory. Their names survived only on weathered gravestones scattered through Balfour district cemeteries, unaccompanied by account of their deaths or the actions that had led to that fateful August night in 1847. And yet the story of the woman who had endured, survived, and ultimately transformed her life remained vivid in the hearts of those who had known her. Her tale invites reflection. What secrets might still lie buried in forgotten plantation records, in the ashes of destroyed journals, or in the gaps between official reports? What thoughts filled her solitude during those 2 years in the wilderness, living without chains but not yet ready to rejoin the world of others? Her life challenges us to consider resilience, endurance, and the possibility of transformation. It reminds us that history is not solely composed of official records, but also the lived experiences of those who survived circumstances so dire that the only way forward was to become something wholly new.